Trade is a lot like real estate. It's all about the location, and that's why Venice grew to be so wealthy. First of all, an introduction to trade. Sea trade was faster at carrying large quantities of goods than land trade was. For example, many often found it far easier to take the sea route from one side of Italy to the other. This way they skipped the difficult mountain climbs and the swerving roads, if there were any roads present at all, and could instead harness the power of the sea currents and the wind to increase their speed. Therefore, looking at the map of Europe, if goods were to come from the east, how best to get into Central Europe? By following the sea route as much as possible. Venice, located at the tip of the Adriatic, was perfectly suited for this. Let's zoom out. Most trade goods came from the Far East. Silk, dyes, spices, to name a few. These came from modern-day China and India, either along the Silk Road or via the sea routes around the Arabian Peninsula. Merchants would buy these goods in the East, transport them to the Muslim world, and likely sell them for a huge profit. The Muslims would then sell a selection of them for another huge profit to the Christian merchants, either Byzantines or Crusaders, within reach. These merchants would then transport it to Europe for another huge profit. Venice became an obvious place to go due to its location. Here the goods could be sold, and then they would be resold across Central Europe. All the merchants down the line, in theory, make a profit, yet the cost goes up the further along someone is down that line. Although the merchants and key trade routes were able to become rich, most Europeans became poorer, having to pay inflated prices. Meanwhile, the Muslim world, with its monopoly over Europe, would grow rich, undergoing a golden age. The Venetians became master shipbuilders, capitalising on their location. They even eventually created the Venetian arsenal, a huge industrial complex dedicated to shipbuilding. These ships further boosted trade flow in and out of Venice, but also helped Venice protect itself and its shipping routes by constructing a huge fleet of galleys. If you were a merchant transporting valuables, where would you go? The safe Venetian waters guaranteed by one of the strongest navies in the Mediterranean, or pirate-infested waters? Obviously Venice. The Venetians expanded along the Dalmatian coast to build strategically placed harbours which could help further rid the seas of piracy. Of course, as more money began to flow through, banks began to emerge, and as those banks became powerful, they began to compete with one another. And that competition in a highly profitable sector brings out the very best in capitalist innovation. These massive banks generating interest, merged with innovation, allowed Venice to grow exponentially on the economic scale. The city of Venice itself became rich through the salt trade. Salt had to be transported and sold to the government. The government would then act as merchants for the salt and created a salt monopoly, making profit for themselves to be reinvested into the city. There were trading rivals, particularly Genoa in this region, who will be covered in a separate video. There would be wars and raids between the two, but ultimately the Venetians would come out on top. In 1202, armies for the Fourth Crusade began to arrive in Venice, yet had no money for ships. Doge Enrico Dandolo, therefore, long story short, offered the ships, yet the troops had to take Constantinople, dismantling the Byzantine Empire and securing Venetian power in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. Yet trade became difficult once the Crusader states fell and Islam took over the regions in full. The Muslims held a monopoly over Venice, and so prices increased rapidly, made worse by the fall of Byzantium to the Ottomans. All of Europe suffered economically from this, and had to pay extravagant prices for the same basic goods we take for granted today. This is where the fall of Venice begins. Alternate routes were looked for, different ways that were safe and secure to tap into the markets of the Far East. Many merchants tried the Siberian route, wanting to connect a new lane to the Silk Road, yet all of these attempts were in vain. As this video began, location in trade is everything. It would be the Portuguese and Spanish who, because of their location, were best positioned to discover these alternate sea routes. The Spanish in the Americas would pull goods across the Atlantic, and the Portuguese reached the Far East through the Cape of Good Hope and would extract the valuable goods from China and India themselves, bypassing the Middle East. If goods could be brought into Spain and Portugal and resold at a cheaper price there, then why go to Venice? As colonial trade expanded, the routes of Western Europe became more profitable than those of the Mediterranean. Venice collapsed economically alongside many trading areas in the Middle East, as they not only lost their monopoly over the Europeans, but also the passage of trade, as the goods did not need to go through the Middle East at all to reach Europe anymore. Mediterranean trade would only boom again the way it had before when the British took over Egypt and built the Suez Canal. Like Venice, Britain established many strategic ports, taking care to pick all the right locations to defend their trade routes. But by this late point in history, it was too late for Venice to make a comeback, and Britain became the wealthy empire of the seas. I hope you learned something, and if you want to learn more, I highly advise this 10-part series I am making on the history of the Medici banking family. I highly recommend it, and make sure to subscribe to get notified of those future episodes.